Good morning, good morning. Please let me know if you cannot hear me. Everything good? Okay. Well, good morning. Glad that you're here this morning, and we're glad for people that are joining us online. I can't start in on David this morning until I get one thing out of the way. I did remember. I wanted something to say about the fathers that are here today. And I also wanted to do it in a scriptural way. So I went to a place that I always go to, which is called the priestly benediction. It's found in Numbers 6. This is what the Lord told Moses to instruct Aaron and the priest to tell the people of Israel. And just look at these wonderful words. And in fact, while you're looking at that one, I'm going to read it in the NIV because the NIV, I think, does a pretty good job in translating this. Said, the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. And then he says, so they will put my name on the Israelites and I will bless them. There's a threefold blessing that's hidden in this. And notice the Lord's name, Yahweh, is used 3 times. That's for emphasis. And what this was is helping the Israelites understand God is our Father. And so, for you fathers, I want you to understand what comes with your duties while you're here on earth is pretty steep, just like our moms. We celebrated them back in May. But for the men who have been fortunate enough to serve as fathers of their family, there's no higher calling for the church than the fathers. Let me help you understand where I'm coming from. Without fathers, we don't have a lot of leadership. And the church needs leadership. Number 2, fathers need to be spiritual leaders of their immediate family. And they learn how to do that over a number of years. After they learn that, then they're well equipped to be leaders in God's family, which is here at Champions. So I just want to bless you as the Lord blesses you as a father, but I want you to understand it comes with a responsibility. And as we're studying the life of David and his heart, I want you to understand that God had expectations of his leaders also. He wanted some people that had strong character, had the good heart to follow him. But here's one of the things that you have to understand that I had to learn the hard way. It's not always what I want to do as a father. It's what's best for my children and my family. And so it's not always what I come up with. We have to understand the situation we get into and deal with that to be a good father. And of course, we need to love our children just like God loves us. Okay? I'm going to get off Father's Day for a second. Glad that you fathers are here this morning. We honor you this morning with this day. We're going to start in chapter 19, but we're going to go really fast until we get over to chapter 23. And I'm going to hit some highlights really quick, but I want you to understand some of the things that are in there. Last time we talked about chapter 19, and we talked about David is having to run for his life because King Saul has gotten very jealous of him, and I guess his ego has gotten tripped a little bit because he thought he's the big, handsome king of Israel, And now God has kind of left him, and he's bringing up David. And Saul, by now, in our story, really knows what's going on. And he is very, very jealous of David. And when we read where God took his spirit, his Holy Spirit, away from Saul, and an evil spirit occupied him, we talked about that a little bit, that the evil spirit could be as simple as jealousy, ego, anger, those kinds of things that we attribute to a really bad spirit. Well, it goes from just being angry to wanting to kill David. Now, up to this point, we've already seen him throw spears at him twice in his own household. And so he's really after him. And the thing that probably burns him up more than anything else is his own son has allegiance to David much stronger than he has to his father. And you know that's got to hurt Saul. Now, when Jonathan tried to appeal to Saul, he got a pretty good indication that Saul was not ready to listen to him. Okay, he was very mad. Okay, so the rest of chapter 19 we talked about David's wife, Michal, helping him escape. And where does he go? He goes to Samuel at Ramah. Okay, so you see in the latter part of 19 is when he's going to Ramah. In verse 20, or chapter, he goes to talk. He goes back to Gibeah, and he gets into discussion with Jonathan, and he tells Jonathan that he's very afraid for his life. And Jonathan, you can go back and read this for yourself. But what ends up happening is they kind of make a pact or a covenant, and David then says, well, here's what I'm going to do. There's this thing called the New Moon Festival. And I've got it up there on the screen. It talks about this festival, and you don't get much information about this festival unless you go back to Numbers 10:10, and there's a couple of other places where it shows up. It's even referenced in another Psalms, and I didn't bring it with me. But this New Moon Festival seemed to be not one of the normal festivals of what the children of Israel were supposed to adhere to. It was this annual festival where everyone stopped work, and they actually sacrificed to God. And so David said, well, why don't you tell King Saul, I'm not going to be at his table, and I'm actually going to go back to my family in Bethlehem and observe this festival. And he tried to get an indication of how Saul would react to him. If you look in chapter 20, verse 30, he goes back and meets with Jonathan again after they concoct a way that Jonathan can alert David hiding, or whether Saul is really as angry as David thinks. The arrows, they get together, and this is one of the touching times where they basically admit to each other their bond, and Jonathan is telling him, I know my father is not going to be okay. He's going to try to kill you any chance he can. So we go over to chapter 21. David doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know where to go. So he runs to the priest. Now let me set the stage here. This priest is located in Nob. Nob's outside of Ramah, very close to where Samuel lives. Why was the priest at Nob? Well, if you go back earlier in 1 Samuel, we didn't highlight it because it was kind of pre-Saul, but remember when I pointed out the location of where the priests were making sacrifices to God? It was in Shiloh. Shiloh was the place where the ark and the enclosure that the ark was under, which I called it the portable church, the tabernacle as it was called officially. By the way, God said, I don't need a permanent structure. Remember when the discussion came up later on about building a temple? And God said, I don't need that. I just need to have a place for presence. Why did God need a place for presence on earth? Because sin, remember the diagram we had early on? Sin had separated God from man, and he needed a presence that the priest could go into and offer sacrifices and appeal for the people every year. Well, the tabernacle was a place where they could basically come and offer worship activity on a weekly basis on the Sabbath. And so this tabernacle's there in Shiloh. Well, the Philistines came in and destroyed that and took the ark away. And then a couple of chapters later, the ark comes back and is back in the land of Judah. And so what they ended up doing is they moved it to Nob, close to where really the ongoing prophet, and some people would say priest, Samuel lived. They also set up a school of prophets close by. Now, let's go back to Abimelech for a second. Abimelech was the priest of that time. When David showed up on his doorstep to enter the tabernacle, he was really shocked because he didn't understand why David was there by himself. He was a little afraid. And what happened was, David was coming in for two purposes. One, his men that were following him and battling with him had no food. And he thought, well, I'll go to the priest. Maybe the priest has something to eat. The only thing the priest kept was the 12 loaves of bread that they called the bread of the presence. And that was used in that Sabbath worship. And then through the week, the priest would eat off of that bread and they would bake fresh bread. Well, David asked him, well, can't we have some of this bread? We're hungry. Okay, one thing he wanted was bread. Number two, he was on the run. He had no things to defend himself with. And so he did ask Abimelech if he had any kind of weapons. He says, well, I actually have the sword that you took off of Goliath. It's wrapped up, and you're welcome to that. But now, David had a little bit of a moral problem in that he was trying to get Abimelech to tell him where this stuff was and could he get what he needed. But he had to tell a little bit of a deceptive story about he was on a special mission. So the priest would not, be upset with him showing up on his own. So I mark that in my Bible is lie. First lie from David. Just outright. He knew what he was doing, he did it. Okay? We have to mark that down because we're studying his heart and what molds his heart. And one of the things is that if you fall into that kind of behavior, it's not good, right? So that happened to him. There's more information around eating this bread. Was that legal? in the Jewish community. Not really. Okay? Exodus is where this all begins, back during when the people of Israel were coming into the promised land. But Jesus, and I put the reference up here, we won't go and look at that, but Jesus referred to what David did in an issue that he was addressing in his present day. And let me just net it out for you. What Jesus' information he gave the people then was it was okay for David to do that because there was a greater purpose in hand, which was maintaining the health of the soldiers and David himself. And if hunger comes in conflict with ceremonial laws that these people had already established long ago, Jesus said he did all right to do that. Now, the priest had told David the only way that you can do it is we have to follow the Levitical guidelines, which means you have to be basically clean to enter the area of the presence to get the bread. And David says, well, I am clean, and so are all my men. And one of the questions that came up was, had they had any relations with any women within the last day or so? And he says, no. Not when we're on a mission in battle. They do not come in contact with women. So that's one of the things that they went through. And so he gives them that bread. Okay? Now the next thing that happens in verse 10 of this chapter is he leaves Abimelech, but he does notice that there's a guy that's sitting over there basically waiting to worship before God. I don't know the background of why this was, but he was an Edomite named Doeg. Doeg was the chief sheep herder for Saul. Now you know what happens. Play the story forward. He goes back and he tells Saul, I've seen David. I know where he is. Okay? This comes to some bad. Let me talk about this king first. King Achish was a Philistine king. The Israelites and the Philistines battled on and off all the way from Joshua to current day. They were not friends of each other. So, how did David go to the king? He basically acted like he had lost his mind. Scratched on doors, had dribble coming out of his mouth. The king says, well, he must not be that same guy that when they said, Saul kills his thousands and David kills his 10,000s. He must not be that same guy. So, okay, we'll give him a place to stay. Now, that was temporary because David had no other where to go. I put up here that David ran to Achish another time, and that's in chapter 27. And the situation is a little different the second time, but this time, when he goes right in, they don't know each other. And he's appealing to him for mercy, really. Okay? Now, let me back up. I didn't go to back up. Psalms 34 and Psalms 56, it appears were written about this time when David was in the house of Achish. And you can go and look at those. We're not going to take time to look at those this morning. Okay, so now he moves further south and he goes to a place called Adullam and holds up in a cave. Now this is back in the territory where Saul is, but it's a very hidden cave. This supposedly is a picture that a friend of mine took when he made a tour over there years ago. And this is assumed to be the cave where David and his family gathered to basically come together and try to comfort each other. At this point, David's thinking, my family's in great danger from Saul also, not just me. So what are we going to do about that? So David basically makes a pact with them that we're going to pick up and move to somewhere where it's much safer for all of us. And I put up there that by now, about 400, I would call them outlaws. They were soldiers, but they had left the ranks of Saul and had joined David. So David's starting to build his army as he goes. Okay? Now he runs over to Moab. You remember where Moab was? It's over in the further east. And you know how much conflict that the Israelites had with the Moabites. But David played a family card. He appealed to them in that Ruth, who they well knew in the Moab community, was his great-grandmother. So it didn't hurt. So they welcomed him and told him that, we will take care of your family. Don't worry about that. And David just wanted to find a place where they could stay until some of this conflict was over with. Now, I did mention one other person up there, which is a prophet. And this prophet is only mentioned a couple of times in the Bible. So we don't have a whole lot of information on him, but his name was Gad. And I always remember when we're talking about names in the tribes that there's a Gad, and then what's the next name that comes along? Asher. That's my grandson. So that's how I remember that. Okay? But Gad, I'm glad they didn't call him Gad. That'd been really bad. But Gad he had some powers. He actually was called a seer. And we find out later on, in chapter 24, he's labeled as David's seer. Okay, so that's pretty important to keep up with. Now, he runs to a forest of Hereth. And again, he's trying to get away from all the things that are going on. At the same time he's in this forest hiding, Saul has now brought some of his army to Nob. And what he's going to do is he's basically going to call into account these people that have put up David and supported him. Well, his men wouldn't even do anything to those priests. And it says that there were 85 priests there. And so he looks at Doeg, and Doeg says, I'll be glad to. And Doeg killed everybody. Now, this was unheard of at this time, where 85 priests and their town and their families were all executed. But let me point you back to 1 Samuel 4 when we were talking about Eli. These priests were family descendants of Eli and his family, the Levites. And what did God say in 1 Samuel 4? We pointed that out when we were going through it real quickly. Probably don't remember. I'm giving you way too much information. There will be a time where your whole family will be wiped out. This is the fulfillment of that prophecy, 1 Samuel 4. Okay? Now, there's one person that escaped. Abimelech's son, he had three. One of his sons, Abiathar, was actually able to escape and run to David. Now, he becomes a big supporter of David, and from here on out, he's going to be David's priest who appeals to the Lord for answers and things like that. Okay? Psalms 52 was written about this time when Doeg was actually doing this, and I'm not going to read this, but there's some really strong statements in here about David understanding what's wicked and who is wicked and what the characteristics of a wicked person is. But he also comes down and basically says, there will be an end to these wicked people. And I know it, God, because you're faithful and you will take care of that. And then the rest of that is the praise for the righteousness. So what I'm trying to do when I go through these stories is take a moment to say, David was conscious enough in the moment to write and pen some of these things that have been captured, and we see them now in the Psalms. It just gives me more information about what David is thinking at the time. Okay? Now, from there, David starts down a path toward the Dead Sea. And he's going to go to a place that he heard where the Philistines were basically attacking this community, agricultural community. Let's go to that, okay? He was told, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are looting the threshing floors, okay? Stop there a minute. I'm going to show you a picture. This is what one of the ancient threshing floors looked like. Now, I did a little agricultural study here for just about 5 minutes, and that's about as far as I'm going to go. Some of you are probably experts at threshing. Okay, but let me give you a real quick two-second survey of this. Pull the grain in, take it to the threshing floor, stomp it with your feet, or run cattle over it, or whatever you've got to crush the grain stalks that will separate the good grain from the chaff. We all together so far? Okay, why did the outdoor threshing floors work so well? The wind helped out. It blew the chaff out easily. If you did it indoors, which you still have things today that represent this, they have to somehow separate that out, and they'll actually fan it or blow wind in or whatever to get the chaff out. Okay, and then you collect the grain up, and then it's good. So that's what they were doing. Now, why is this so important? One reason is agriculturally what was going on at the time was, have you remembered there have been famines and difficulty with people getting the food they need and the stress that puts on them? There's a passage in Joshua that talks about how these different tribes were coming in and trying to take over anything like this to their advantage. Well, the Philistines brought their biggest army and came into this town, which was kind of on the territory of where the Philistines were and where the Israelites were, and basically took it over and stole all that good grain. So they had nothing that they could use to eat. That's why this was really important. And notice what this says. David's men said to him, we're afraid. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces? And then David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, go down to Keilah, for I'm going to give the Philistines into your hand. Okay? And so he went down there and fought them and won. There is one little point here, and I'm going to make it really quick because we'll zip through this and we'll come back to it later on in this study. How did God communicate with David? We're not sure. But here's one of the things that gives us some indication. It said Abiathar, we just talked about him, right? He had left Nob and come to live with David, and he appealed by bringing the ephod. What was the ephod? I'll give you some pointers on that, and you can go back and research that if you like, but it's a breastplate and a linen covering that the priest would put on when they go into the most holy places in the tabernacle. And these things were fit out with different things, little objects, gold, purple, just beautiful. But one of the things that were in there, let me see if I've got it on here. It's a linen apron, okay? It says he brought it in. The reason that I wanted to bring this up was at the same time this is going on, there are activities not appealing to God through any means, going to people that we call diviners or magicians or people like that to get an answer. And we're going to see Saul fall into that trap very soon. So it wasn't just the non-Israelites that did that kind of stuff. Some of the Israelites would feel like they were pressured, so they had to go do that too. So here's what the Urim and the Thummim look like, and they almost, to me, it look like dice. There's different categories of the way people look at this. I have no idea what those actually look like. These are just representations of what people have over time historically tried to piece together. There's multiple theories about this. Those things could be thrown down and give a yes or no answer. Or in some cases, it seemed like they had pieces of the Hebrew alphabet on them, and some of the combinations would give them we could go on and on about that. I don't really know, but I do want to mark this as a point that even David, through his priest, asked God's guidance. And sometimes they were using these things, so we just need to keep that in mind. Okay, now, David goes to the desert of Judah. In chapter 23, really Jonathan decides that, hey, I know that you're going to be the king. No question about that, okay? Then he moves on to the wilderness of Maon, and there's 3 other psalms, it seems like, when he was in this area that David penned those psalms, giving us an idea of how he's feeling at the time. And then he goes to the hill country of Ziph, and this is kind of I think it's the final meeting between David and Jonathan. And it's pretty touchful how they pour out their hearts to each other. And then the Ziphites, of course, they're in their territory, so they have an affinity to Saul, and so they go back and tell Saul where they think David is. 3 other psalms when he's in this hill country. One of them I thought was pretty cool, and we're going to look at it in just a second. But here's a picture this friend took of this wilderness area. He got up on a real high hill and took it. These names are the ones that you will see: Ziph, Maon, En-Gedi. They're all part of the Judean wilderness. It is thought that John the Baptist preached there. Give you an idea of where this comes back a little to the 1st century. And possibly the wilderness where Jesus was tempted. Again, these are all speculations. There's no guarantee that that's true. There is something true there that still is there. There's 2 magnificent structures that have been built that people go and view when they visit this part of the Holy Land. And they were both created by Herod the Great. And we know who he was, right? He was the one right before Jesus was born that was putting the edict out to kill all the children. Remember him? Not a good guy. But in his defense, he was trying to keep his own people from revolting against him, so he built a couple of fortresses, I guess for himself, okay? The Auditorium is one, and then Masada is a place where a lot of people ran for refuge and then committed suicide. And so if you ever go over there, or if you want to read about it, you can get the stories of that. This Psalm 31, just listen to these 2 things. I'm going to go through this real quickly. He says, "Incline your ear to me, rescue me speedily, be a rock of refuge for me, a fortress to save me." Okay, it's clear that David has not lost his trust in God's deliverance. He's not wavering whatsoever. He still believes God's in control. That's a message for us. No matter what we go through, we can always trust God. We can always trust he's going to follow through because God is faithful, okay? Look at verse 5. Have you ever heard that before? "Into your hand I commit my spirit." Jesus on the cross, he's taking the words from David. Now, I don't profess to understand the dynamics between those, but it shows the interlinking of the heart. Does that make sense? They're on one page, in other words. Okay? And Jesus was feeling very human when he made that statement. And so was David. Okay? More complaints, I won't go through all of that. That psalm is very long. Solomon even talks about En Gedi when he wrote Song of Solomon. It says, "My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of En Gedi." And that's what this paradise in the middle of desert was known for. In fact, I'll show you a couple more pictures. Here's a picture that this guy that I knew took. This is supposed to be in 1 Samuel 23:28. It talks about David going to the rock of escape. Okay? This picture is also, he took this picture for another reason. You know when Jesus was talking to the lady at the well, and they started talking about living water? This is what's always referenced. Because living water in those times was flowing water that was fresh. Jesus used that as he's talking to the Samaritan woman. So just keep that in mind. This is where that is over in the Holy Lands. This is also the place. There's all kind of rocks here. And then I also put a source that I found that had another picture that's called Salam. Okay, let me explain. Both of those words, one in Hebrew, one in Arabic or Muslim, mean peace. And they call it because now when they reference it on tours, they use them both because they don't know who they're talking to, whether they're a Christian belief or a Muslim belief. So that's why they call it that. This is also the place that we get into in chapter 24, which is Saul was looking for David. David goes back in the innermost parts of a cave, and Saul comes in, I would say, to relieve himself. The Hebrew says cover his feet. I don't know how those two come together, but again, that's what it says. Well, he went in to do that, okay? David had every opportunity to take revenge on him. Think about what David had gone through up to this time. How much running and anger had he put up with Saul? And in his heart, he also knew that the Lord was going to make him king. Why didn't David go ahead and just take care of Saul? And then he could have been king. Well, David didn't do that because David trusted the God that we worship. And that God has his own timetable of when he's going to have things done. And we have to learn to trust him. That's what David taught me. We may want it now. God will provide it when God sees it's the right time. And so David knew that, and David was not going to take him. So what he did was he went in, took a piece of his cloak, and then went outside in front of all the people. I might have put that on another slide. Let me go through this psalm. You know, he made the point in front of Saul's people too, that look, I have done all these things for you, and you're trying to kill me. He's trying to appeal to Saul. If there's any good still in Saul, he's trying to appeal to him. And so what happens is he just didn't take revenge. And that's a good point on David's heart because he certainly had the opportunity. Okay? Now, there's one other story this morning. David moves on to an area, it's called Carmel. It's not Mount Carmel. Okay? That's another place in the Bible. You can go look that up. But Nabal owned a lot of land, and he had a lot of sheep. Let me make sure I get the number right, because sometimes I don't get the number right. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. 3,000 sheep could produce over 6,000 pounds of wool in one season. I tried to do the math. Of course, I don't know what the current value of wool was back then. But even at a deflated time when it's really gone down, at our time, you know, that's anywhere from $2 to $5 a pound. So do the math. Thousands and thousands of dollars at least. So Nabal was quite wealthy for his time. He wouldn't even give David and his men bread or water. And his wife was good enough to intercept a battle, because I think David would have gone to retaliation, which would not have looked well on David, because David was not that kind of person. But he felt like that he had been humiliated, and his men were hungry. So what could he do? Well, he split his army up, and he went after them. But this wife of Nabal basically stepped up, brought things for the men, and apologized. End of the story, Nabal basically falls and kills himself. Now Abigail needs a husband, and David takes her on. So David adds another wife. Real quick, just some questions that I want you to think about. We probably don't have a lot of time to talk about them this morning. I want you to go back and look at this in chapter 19, because it's a mystery to me. Maybe you know what this is. But when that school of prophets were meeting, and Saul sent men to flush him out to find David, it says all the prophets that were in attendance there were in a spiritual frenzy. That's what my translation said. I don't know what that really means, other than they were acting out, in other words. And they were full of the Spirit. Okay? Saul sent 3 parties of men down there, and all of them ended up joining the party of the spiritual frenzy. So then Saul decides to go down. And Saul himself was filled with the Spirit. It said he was filled with the Spirit to the point that he basically took all his clothes off and stayed that way all night, dancing around and being full of the Spirit. I don't pretend to understand any of that, okay? I'm just saying it happened. And I'm not sure how we describe the Spirit even today and what the Spirit can do. I know historically we've always said, well, that was back then, and this is a different time. Well, I'm not sure over the years I believe that anymore. That's a simple way to look at it, but I'm not sure that's true. I think we just need to agree, my opinion only, that the Spirit does what the Spirit is going to do. And it can do things that maybe we can't understand, but we know there's got to be a reason, because it's from God. Okay? Did David think a lie was a sin? Okay, I'll answer that one for you. Yes, because he had grief and sorrow about all those priests dying because of him. And that cut him to the heart. Now, he still lied, so we've got to put up with that. Did he violate the law eating the holy bread? I think based on his understanding at the time, I don't think he felt like that was something that violated the old law. And I felt like that with Jesus, using it as an example of there's a greater purpose of keeping people fed versus having these restrictions around who and when and what they could eat that bread for. I think that helps us understand that I don't think he did violate the law. And then the big question is, Jonathan, isn't he taking a lot of risk with helping David? I think he is. I mean, he's already been called something really bad and called out his mother too, which I think, Saul is not happy with Jonathan. Now, we're going to see, we'll close here, but we're going to see where Jonathan and Saul's end is coming. And I read that, and I don't get sad reading about Saul dying, because I think he had lost the Spirit of God. But for people like Jonathan, it hurts my feelings to read that. Okay, let's close with a prayer. Dear God, we're so thankful for this beautiful day you've given us, this day that we want to remember our fathers and what they mean to all of us. But Father, we also know that you are the ultimate Father, and that we all have you as our Father, and you're always there willing to help and to listen to us as we deal with our day-to-day lives. Father, bless us as